to introduce the next speakers. Our next speakers are Stephen Macfarlane and Jill Laver, who are going to talk on A Happy Accident and Its Aftermath, a case history of architectural archiving. And this is the story of how the RIBA drawings collection ended up with the drawings from Corb's lecture.
My name is Stephen Macfarlane, and I was fortunate to arrive at the AA school without taking an exam in 1945. And in 47, I was one of 3 representatives of the AA third year, of which there were about 130 students, a huge year. So we had 3 representatives. The others were Jean Simons, then Jean Layton, and Herbert Morel. Jean Simons and Herbert Morel, that's right. And they're both here today. I'm very pleased to support me. The chairman of the committee at that time was Peter Bosanquet, who was in the 5th year, and Andrew Derbyshire was the first year behind us, and he was the treasurer of the committee. And Bernard Fielden was one of the 4th year representatives. Christopher Knight of the 5th year and I were both representatives of the Students' Committee on the AA House Committee. And there were several of us, or our committee representatives for the AA main committees, including education and so on. And so it was, as has been described, an extraordinary and dangerous school seen by the establishment. The first centenary of the AA was celebrated in December 1947, and the Students' Committee had been successful, as we've heard, in securing a visit by Le Corbusier to speak to students, which took place on the 18th of December in the largest lecture hall here, which is now the actual workshop of down below in the basement. And there were 6 large sheets of cartridge paper, approximately 1.5 meters by 1.2 meters. These were pinned up in a group at the back of the stage in anticipation of an illustrated lecture by Le Corbusier, who spoke in French and who was accompanied on stage by Clive Entwistle and Alan Ballantyne, our chairman, and they were both interpreters for Corb. I'm sorry, I've pressed a button and I haven't been actually, but don't be too diverted. Yes, thank you. Can you switch it off? No. Okay. And anyway, this was started, and Corb, speaking rapidly to his current range of concerns, while using a few coloured crayons and to illustrate the topics from his agenda, his current agenda at that time, which included the US and UN Assembly and Marseille, of course. I cannot now remember who carried the responsibility for that event and its aftermath. However, the drawings were taken away from the stage after Corb, actually after each topic, he just ripped a piece of the paper off the wall and dropped it on the floor. And of course there were about 6 rolling about on the stage afterwards. But I don't know who actually collected them up. But about 4 or 5 ended up on the walls of Ching's Head, which is just below us here in the basement. And I've worked out that it was probably too small to take more than about 4 of those drawings. And of course, we wonder where the other 2 have got to. It would be wonderful if the collective memory here might produce some ideas. But the whole point was that these drawings were there for the whole of the spring term, from January 1948 until Easter. Some mention is recorded in committee minutes about the drawings, but no action appears to have been settled. Certainly the Housing Committee, that's the AA Housing Committee, declined our suggestion to provide a permanent display in this very room. What happened then is engraved on my memory. The spring term ended as usual with a party and a dance which lasted into the early hours. I believe that the fact I missed the celebration was fortunate, as for some reason the need to retrieve something from the studio caused me to return to Bedford Square on the following Saturday morning to find an AA apparently empty of any life. And the square was pretty empty of any life as well. Just a strange sort of atmosphere of emptiness. The front door of number 36, however, was ajar, and the traditional morning after smell of stale beer and cider was very evident. I entered the hall just out there, the main hall of number 36, where the existing staircase goes down to the basement. In those days, there was no fire sort of logging. It was just an open landing, and you could actually see see down to the basement floor level. I glanced down and saw our caretaker, Mr. Barr, wrestling with a pile of waste paper, which he was stuffing into large sacks. Among this debris, I noticed some very large half-rolled sheets of paper, and I suddenly recognized with horror that these, in fact, might have come from Ching's Head. So I went down rapidly to ask Mr. Barr what was going on. And he explained that he had stripped the papers from Ching's Head in readiness for redecoration during the vacation, having insisted that the 4 sheets still intact, standing there, would be taken by me, acting on behalf of the House Committee. I carefully rolled all that I found together and carried the roll onto a 24 bus, which went up to Hampstead Terminal, near where I was living at that time. I then assumed the role of self-appointed caretaker for the drawings and carefully wrapped them with interleaving of tissue paper and put them into a protective tube and placed it in a safe corner of my parents' house when I disappeared for the vacation and went into, of course, the new summer term when I came back. But these drawings remained sort of dormant in my parents' house for 8 years. And then at that time, I had a new permanent home in Bristol and the family, and the drawings came back to me from my parents under my care again. In 1970, we go forward again, with renewed interest in Le Corbusier's work. My wife Jean got expert advice about what we should do, how we should protect these drawings. They were still rolled up at that time, or pinned up now and again for some teaching. And when Peter Smithson came down to teach, I was then teaching at the RWA school in Bristol. Anyway, these drawings, my wife on her own initiative got mounted and put into protective frames. They were then safely visible and available for the occasional exhibition, but always kept in shaded places where no sunlight could reach them. My friends in the profession and former colleagues who became AA members were aware of the existence of these drawings, about which I'd made clear to anybody that inquired that mine was a temporary responsibility for this intellectual property, which I regarded as a legacy of our student initiative in 1947. The end of my story comes when I retired in 1990. The time had come to pass on responsibility for the drawings. Advice from alumni from those days produced a consensus that allowed an approach to be made to Jill Lever of the then Heinz Gallery drawing collection, at the which was then part of the RIBA, I think, Jill. And having also obtained endorsement from Andrew Derbyshire, who is here with us today, and Bernard Fielden, who alas isn't, but his widow has sent a message to me to hope that this symposium is successful, and I'm so pleased to say, and I'm sure we can all say that in comfort to Lady Fielden. The fact now is that we have a means to protect the Le Corbusier's drawings, which we see as a gift to Britain, which Jill will now describe the aftermath. Thank you, Jill.
This is just a postscript to what Stephen has said. When the decision had been made that they would be offered to the drawings collection, Mrs. Macfarlane wrote to us in August 1990, and she was very concerned that the drawings wouldn't be given away or sold, and I was able to promise her that that would not happen, and it won't. The offer was very readily accepted. Everyone was incredibly thrilled, actually. I had thought that we would have some Corb drawings, and I and my architect husband had hoped to collect the drawings from the Macfarlanes in Bristol ourselves, but our car was not large enough, the drawings being 4'10" by 3'10" by 3 inches thick, and a van was sent to collect them. They arrived on a Monday afternoon, and everybody in the drawings collection gathered together, and as I wrote to Jean and Stephen Macfarlane, it was very exciting waiting for the unwrapping of the Corb drawings, because they were so well wrapped, there were layers and layers and stuff, beautifully done, of the Corb drawings, and really quite an emotional moment when at last they could be seen. It was extraordinarily generous of you to present your cherished drawings, and the RIBA is immensely grateful to you, and still is, of course. There was, and there is, one other Corb drawing in the drawings collection at the RIBA, a preliminary site plan for Chandigarh, drawn by Le Corbusier on the 3rd and 4th of May 1951. Actually, the dates are on the drawing. And given by Bill Howell to the RIBA in 1966. John Partridge has reminded me that they were rescued from the wastepaper basket in Corb's office in Paris. And I wondered if Bill Howell was at the lecture of 1947, but Stephen says that he would have come to the AA in the autumn of 1948, so he wouldn't have been there. Stephen has suggested that I take this opportunity of encouraging architects to reflect on the matter of archiving their drawings. The RIBA collects not only drawings, but also manuscript material and photographs, many, many photographs, and also drawing instruments, and in the past, at any rate, office furniture. This is to have an idea of office practice, architect's office practice, and so the instruments are actually quite important, and even the stools and the tables and so on. Did they stand up in the 19th century, or did they sit down? That sort of thing. It's not possible for the RIBA, or indeed any institution, to collect everything, but they can and do give advice. And the county record offices are now much more aware of the importance of architects' records. The changeover to computer-aided design offers other possibilities, but the initial designs are still often drawn by hand and give a wonderful insight into the process of architectural design. At present, I'm working at Sir John Soane's Museum, and though it might be a slight exaggeration to say that Soane preserved absolutely everything, most things have been kept, and it is fascinating to trace the history of the building, or perhaps an unrealized competition design, through the drawings and the correspondence and the account books and all that sort of material. And as far as possible, we need to retain at least some of the records of 20th century architects. But that task really begins with the architect.
Thank you. That was, from a librarian's perspective, extremely interesting. I want to make one other brief announcement. I meant to make it before and it slipped my mind. The exhibition, which is upstairs in the front members' room, will be opening directly after this event, and there will be a small reception up there with some bubbly, and you're all welcome to go up and have a glass and have a look around. The exhibition will be open for the next 2 weeks. The next speaker is Tim Benton, who's going to speak. The title of his talk is C'est triste, pleurer, Le Corbusier's view about Britain.
Yes, it sort of is. It's also, what's prompted this was this document from the Fondation Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier kept a lot of records of his lectures. I mean, there are about 1,200 pages of notes for his lectures, various different times. But this is all there is for anything remotely connected with his lecture, except that, curiously, it says Londres New School, 1948. So, as far as I know, there isn't a new school, A. He may have been confused with New York. And it's not 1948, it's 1947, December 1947. And actually, Le Corbusier was usually quite precise about dating his lecture notes, unlike his drawings, which his early drawings he didn't date at all. So this got me sort of thinking, and I looked at Le Corbusier's process in general, and so I tried to get into the head of Le Corbusier when he came here. So in a sense, this is a roman à clé. We're going to come back to that document at the end. And I'm going to try and suggest the kinds of things that might have been in his head. I'm not saying what he said because I wasn't there. In the presence of many primary sources, I'm in a position of blissful ignorance. And as an archival historian, I don't have any documents to work on. So I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to talk about two aspects of Le Corbusier's lecturing method. One is the exordium. The exordium in classical rhetoric is where the rhetorician builds a bridge to his audience to make them love him, basically, to soften them up for what he's going to tell them. And that's the first thing I'm going to talk about. And the second is his view about the English, except that most of the evidence I'm going to use is about the Dutch and the Swiss. But I'm going to ask you to, in some ways, they were the same in Le Corbusier's thinking. So, in 1929, when he was on the boat Marsilia on the way to give 10 lectures in Buenos Aires, he wrote lots of notes preparing his lectures. And this is the kind of notes that he wrote. It's a kind of classical structure of an argument. I won't try and take you through it, but it's the Zeitgeist Argument. You know, the world has changed, architecture must change as well. And that's how he starts off doing it. And on the left, you can see a little bit more how he kind of builds up the argument. In this case, he's developing the three aspects of the age, which has changed: technology, economic sociology, and sociology, economics, and politics, rather. And these are kinds of things that the architect has to absorb. In the second lecture, he actually begins the lecture with this quite well-known, I think, diagram, which is published in Précision, which shows these three things as the three courses of a meal that the architect absorbs. Le Corbusier was a dualist, so he absorbs this roughage, and then he draws a line, and then the digestion works, and he smokes his pipe, and the little bird comes out, and that is inspiration. That is his relationship between the spirit and the material world. He wasn't a functionalist, he wasn't a materialist, obviously. So this is how he was preparing this first lecture. He set it up talking about the academies, the academic architects, and so forth. This is actually from the third lecture, but it doesn't really matter. But this is his kind of approach. But when he got to Buenos Aires, he did something quite different. And this is the exordium. Because the lecture actually begins like this. He says, let me just find the place. Okay, I'll paraphrase it. He says, I've been walking all over Buenos Aires for the whole week. I've seen everything. I understand the city. It's like a solid ingot of sort of massive, dense urbanism. It's wonderful, it's heroic, it's the new center of the world along with New York. It's terrific, but it's crazy. Now what he's doing there is he's trying to say, I've seen your city, I understand it, but then he's going to say, but I'm going to design a new plan that will change it completely. Okay. And this is a typical way that he worked in his lectures. This is another aspect of the exordium, where in a later lecture, lecture 8, he says when he's actually he gives up on halfway through a lecture that he prepared on the plan voisin adapted to Buenos Aires. He says, right, now I'm going to teach you students, architecture students, about architecture. And this is the first of his lectures that led up to the thing published in Plan, If I Were to Teach You Architecture. This was in 1929 already, he did this. And this is one of his examples. He says, when you walk through Buenos Aires, you find these houses which have, and this is Proto-Venturian, two aspects. They have a back and a front. In the back, there is always a steel windmill. Okay. Now, when he was drawing this, he actually said, now you're bursting out laughing because I've drawn the steel windmill and you think I'm going to make fun of you, Argentinians. He says, no, this is the best bit of the house. When you design a house, always start with the steel windmill. The steel windmill is honest. Only if you do that will you be on the right lines. And then he says, go around the front. He says, the jolie patisserie italienne. These are the Italian masons who designed a facade with balustrades and some porticos and things like that. This is the bit of the house where you say, this is who I am, I'm a bourgeois person. And that, obviously, is wrong from Le Corbusier's point of view. So, later on in the lecture series, this is how he redesigns Buenos Aires. And the reason I've gone a little bit around this way of explaining this is that this sketch is actually something that he drew on the sheet of paper that I showed you at the beginning, that we'll come back to at the end, the plan of Buenos Aires. And I rather suspect that when he did this sheet of notes, he was thinking of doing something similar to London. Now, I'd be very interested to know whether he actually did, in the AA lecture, redesign London. There's no evidence of it that I know about, and Mars had already done it. But clearly in his mind, he was going to finish with some sort of modern urban plan. Okay. And I mean, another example of his exordium, which again I'd love to know from our primary sources here, whether he did any of this here in the AA, to appeal to the British people. This is how he appealed to the Argentinians. He says, I invoke the Argentinian soul to arouse the poet who will express in the overall planning of the country the grandeur that is available, the grandeur that is possible in a new country. And he says, when I draw things for you, I will draw things that are based on fact, on iron fact and science and technology. But I want you to pluck the lyres of your heart as you watch. You will turn the iron logic of my presentation into an Argentinian poetry which will express the new architecture. But that was typical of the kind of way he approached things. What did you think about England then? Well, we don't know from a lecture, but we know from a letter that he wrote to Lubetkin. Remember, Le Corbusier came over in 1935 to inaugurate, at Lubetkin's invitation, because they knew each other when Lubetkin had been in Paris, to inaugurate High Point 1. And Le Corbusier wrote Lubetkin a letter. Lubetkin took him all around London and showed him all the works of modern architecture and so forth, and also showed him some things that Le Corbusier wanted to see. But this is what Le Corbusier says. He actually hired a plane from Croydon Airport to survey London. He says, 10 million inhabitants going about their business make the London high street swarming with life, magnificent and intense. The traffic which has to square the circle of huge commuting distances, bus, tube, taxis, motor cars, throws us into a torrent of movement. The buses are splendid, red and covered with beautiful writing, as tall as siege engines. They advance like herds of racing elephants. It's really a spectacle. The London tube stations impress me with their scale, their cleanliness, the comfort offered to the passengers, as well as their respect for the facilities provided for them. Lining the torrent of cars are the London shops filled with goods, their copper surfaces polished, their marble washed clean, and their windows sparkling. You feel the power of merchandise. Finally mixed up in this violent adventure, the poor pedestrian. What flexibility, what tenacity, what resignation, what optimism. He doesn't revolt. He accepts this new role which his forefathers did not know. It's very perceptive, it's very interesting. His forefathers did not know. All this, as I perceive it and I understand it, is madly amusing, follement dingue, madly amusing. It's like a fairground attraction with a joyous dynamism. But it's crazy, c'est fou, c'est triste à pleurer. And this is how he's setting up. You know, I've understood you people in England, but I'm going to change it for you. Or you're going to change it. So that's all I'm going to say about the exordium. Le Corbusier had a view about the English, the Americans, the Dutch, and the Swiss, which is roughly comparable. That is, they'd taken functionalism too far. They hadn't understood the secret of modern architecture, his secret of synthesis, which has been mentioned already, which is to turn the raw materials of modernism into art, into architecture. So I'm going to jump about a little bit, but you just have to, well, you can reject it if you like. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to jump about. On September the 13th, 1958, Le Corbusier is flying from Stockholm to Paris. Departure 8:30 a.m., 20-minute stopover in Copenhagen, and then Paris at 11 o'clock. Warmed by smoked salmon and some whiskies, he philosophizes about his recent discussions in Stockholm. The question of functionalism. Now then, gentlemen, orthography and syntax. Okay, fine. Okay, d'accord. But what do you want? Do you want pastry or do you want the heart? But watch out for affairs of the heart. Watch out for the diseases of the heart. If you base your spirit on function, on, as he says, the rocks, they're hard and they're cold. If, on the other hand, you allow your heart to take free course, then you will be seasick and it will be like Dante in Purgatory. And then he warms to his task. He says, this Dutch distribution of land seems to me very functionel, spelled in the German way, very Van Eastern, very stupid, stuffed up, constipated, finish. There's nothing left to do but to die. One's done one's duty. What we need here is a human purge, organised, ruled, functional, and then afterwards the paradise of idiots. You will be happy. We're really going to have fun. We're going to sing some psalms with our nipples on our knees. And then he, after a description of the Swedish lakes and forests, which he admires, the plane crosses over the Netherlands. Then he says there's Holland, with Functionel, again spelled in the German way. Good God, everything's ordered. Even the sea is dominated by the dunes, the polders, the canals by the buildings, the autoroutes with their crossings, with their regular crossings, and these terrible paradisical garden cities where the families go mad in their enclosures, their hedges, their garden, etc. You'd say this was the plan of an architect. Foutez-les-moi en pile, stack them high, 50 meters high, 2,000 together, brassez, brew, stew them together, put them together, and wait for the commune to form, because that will be life. The shocks and frottement, the rubbing together, but embed everybody in their own bed, please, he says. So this is his argument against functionalism, and a piece of evidence drawing the Swiss in. When he writes to his Swiss friend and supporter Rudolf Futter in 1950, he declared, I have to insist with the greatest possible strength. He was designing a house for Futter. Futter was his patron on the Pavillon Suisse. These terrible Swiss, ces sacrés Suisses, irritate me with their conception of exaggerated finish in architecture. You are a wise man and so am I. We are not bourgeois. We appreciate the roughness of bare brick, of joints roughly made by the mason, with a rough plaster inside,
on bare brick to make a contrast. So it wasn't that it wasn't that technical perfection was insufficient. It was actually worse. It was unsophisticated and it was bourgeois. The English and the Dutch and the Swiss were unable to appreciate real quality. As he said of his English the two English colleagues, Max Fry and Jane Drew, and his associate, Pierre Jeanneret, at Chandigarh, none of these three senior architects have the smallest idea of the sign. More than that, they oppose the sign with the strongest possible break on account of health and safety. SOS, save our souls. And he goes on to say, I accept signs, I believe in signs, because they are the expression of the realities lived by lived realities and the evocation of questions which have no answer. I pause before symbols, before the metaphysical. Because this equals imagination, a valuable creation in time and place, objects and fetishes to be exploited by man. A place, a terre d'asile, a place of exile for people who've run away, who've escaped. That's my time, is it?
No. That is
You've got 5 minutes.
I've got 5 minutes. That's perfect. I'm running on rails. Imagination, a valuable creation in time and place. Objects and fetishes for exploitation, for man's exploitation. A home of exile for people who've escaped, for escapers and escapees, and mythoman, people who believe in myths. So, I'm just going to jump on there. So I think we can. So he did a lecture in. He did 3 lectures in Holland, where he actually in the 1930s, where he carried through this kind of argument against Dutch functionalism, where he was very well received, and the De Acht en Opbouw group very generously, gave him a very good hospitality, although he talked against them to some extent. And when he went back to Paris, he actually gave a very positive description of the beauty of the Dutch landscape and the order and so forth. So he's able to be charming and dish it out alternately. So, what can we make of this document? London, New School, 1948. The top line is it's talking about the Siam grills. The grills which they worked on at Siam. And this is a typical example of reaching out to the local modernists, to the Bars Group people who were working on these grills. The urbanism grills tied to the hinterland, using the English word hinterland, to the oceans, and then he talks about a drawing, in an Ascaral drawing. And then he says, un arbre naît, a tree grows. And he says, une maison, le lac, that's the house that he designed for his parents by the side of Lake Geneva, photos, or Savoie, or Marseille, and then un palais, une maison, a house, or a palace, subject to the title of a book of his, the 2 ways in which architecture expresses itself. United Nations, that was mentioned as something that he discussed on the East River, and he would talk about that. Now what's he doing there? What he's saying is, okay, we're going to do these, we're all going to work together in Siam to do these urban grills, but the really important thing is this tree, which is growing, which is turning all this into art. So a section of his lecture, if he'd followed this, would have been to talk about architecture as art. And then there's a mysterious thing where he says les répartitions des eaux, the division of waters, the melting of the snows, and the grand hydraulique. In all his lectures in the 40s and 50s, he did the law of the meander. So this would have been 20 minutes where he described the law of the meander. We know this because in a number of his lectures where there is a fuller text, he spells it all out in great detail. And in fact, there's one where there's a recording in 1958 in Brussels, and he takes the better part of 20 minutes describing the law of the meander, which is very strange because it's not really about architecture at all. It's a philosophical thing. It's about how events are driven one way and then the other and so forth, and what the architect has to do is to see through, cut through the confusion and head through to the sea. Okay.
And this is again another metaphor for the power of the architect to cut through the practical difficulties. And then he has a vertical line, and then he says, Les trois établissements humains. This is the Askeral book that he published, and then the La Carte d'Europe. Again, I could find you 5 drawings in which he does that. The law of the meander, Les trois établissements humains, and the map of Europe. This is his plan for the linear city. It's his whole myth of the development of urbanism from the first huts through to the villages and the collections and the towns, and then the radiocentric cities, and then resolved by the problem of the linear city. And then, again, reaching out to the audience, he talks about the centre des vieilles villes, centre of the old cities, which is one of the subjects for Siam, and he's going to talk about Paris, so he's going to show his plans for Paris, and Saint-Dié, his rejected plan for Saint-Dié. And at the bottom of this sheet, he gives this sketch, which is the plan for Buenos Aires drawn in 1929. So I don't know when he did these notes on a piece of paper. Perhaps it was when he was first contacted, perhaps before he'd even agreed to do the lecture. It's difficult to imagine that he did it at the last minute without knowing which year it was. But if it was indeed the AA lecture, I suspect that this is the kind of structure he would have given. He would have tried to convert the English, as he saw it, a barbaric functional nation, to the art of architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just for your information, the text of that lecture is on the wall of the exhibition upstairs, so you'll be able to see it. And it's also in the book, Irene Murray and this book, edited book of Le Corbusier in Britain, and it's a fascinating text. So, our next speaker is William Curtis. Where is William Curtis? Oh, good. He's going to speak. His title of his lecture is Transformation and Invention on Rereading Le Corbusier.
Right. Remove the image, please.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank
Can we remove the... That's good. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Hinder, for tracking me down for this event, which brings together several subjects, people, and places that have meant a lot to me. As I'm standing in this room again, I seem to get here about every 15 years. I'm remembering 29 years ago delivering 8 lectures on Le Corbusier at the AA. It was in the spring of '79, and the immensely intense atmosphere of the whole thing, in which I was endeavouring to deliver some fresh views about a subject which can so easily fall into the hands of those who want to erect academies almost out of Corbusier. And there was a little bit of tension in the air, which was fine. But at the back of the room, there was a loyal friend, a person for whom Corbusier was one of the central driving forces in his life as an artist, along with the figure of Nicholas Hawksmoor. And I'm referring to Dennis Lasdun. And I'd like to dedicate my 20-minute reflection to the memory of Dennis Lasdun, who was a student in this school in the early 30s, and who went to Paris in 1934. And the first building he saw by Le Corbusier was the Pavillon Suisse. And it changed his life. And he completed a project here in 1934-5, a study for a student residence in Regent's Park, for an Academy of Commonwealth and Dominion Scholars, which was an immensely intelligent, not a copying, but a transformation of that basic model of the Pavillon Suisse, but combined with certain schematisms or transformations from classicism in the organization of the building. Now, it so happens, and here I've so enjoyed hearing these personal recollections, so bear with me if I now share my own, that the very first building I saw firsthand by Le Corbusier was the Pavillon Suisse. And it happened when I was 16 years old. In fact, my Le Corbusier, if I may call him that, he came into my life, you could say, first at the age of 15 in school, in a library. Pretty well the only thing I liked about my school was the library. It had wonderful oak shelves and enormous oak tables where you could look out across a park somewhere in the centre of southern England and dream. And there was an extremely eccentric teacher in the school who, after the traumatic experience of the war, being a squadron leader among those who bombed Dresden, had a complete crisis in his life and became eventually a monk. But in the transitional period, when he was a sort of existentialist in Paris in the late 40s, he developed a taste for French literature. And on the shelves, there were all those wonderful uncut Gallimard editions. And I was one of the few people who read these things, but I just love the thing of taking out a penknife and cutting, to discover Rimbaud or what it would be. So when I was supposed to be doing, I don't know, calculus or irregular Latin verbs or some other horrendous thing or another, I was in fact daydreaming and opening books about Picasso and about this and about that. And one day I noticed at the end of the shelves a series of books which I took probably to be a geographical survey or something of the kind. They had a vaguely technical look about them. They were cloth bound. They had strange printed lettering on them. And initially I was a little bit put off by them. I thought they probably aren't that interesting. There's something about those that just looked a little bit too severe. But then one day I took one of them down and opened it. It was the complete works of Le Corbusier. And there I was, carried into a dream world of white villas and enormous cars, men in turbans, reinforcing rods poking out of concrete buildings in India, doodles and sketches of oxen, and I have to say, I was caught. At the age of 16 then, I set out on a pilgrimage. I come from East Kent. It's not difficult to go to Dover. It was April, and it was cold. I decided I would hitchhike to Ronchamp as a form of pilgrimage somehow. This was all well and good until after 4 or 5 hours, I found I was still stuck in Boulogne-sur-Mer, watching the same seagull moving around on a chimney pot. Spent the night in a wood near Abbeville in the pouring rain. Gave up very quickly on my hitchhiking career. Became quite good at it later, but not then. So with tail between legs, took the train to Amiens and then to Paris. And then the first building I saw was the Pavillon Suisse. 10 days ago, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of that building. So I found myself sitting under those pilotis, remembering things that happened to me more than 40 years ago. What was it for me? It was something about the nobility of that space in the pilotis underneath. Something about the combination of flotation and density in the building. Something about the way it moves you around as you move through it. And heaven knows what else, because I was very young, but I was astounded by it. So Corbusier somehow had gone into my motor, you could say. There were many other chapters, of course, which I'm not going to go into here. Becoming a student in the history of art, getting thoroughly fed up with some of my teachers, going off in a sulk to look at the Royal College of Physicians and thinking, that's more my destiny than what I'm learning in school. Realizing that that building itself was in fact an extremely complex transformation of the Pavillon Suisse, but 35 years later, and so on and so forth, which I'm not going to go into here. So Corbusier has been for me a subject of historical study, but he's been a great deal more. I would say the effect that Corbusier has is very different for every person, but he's difficult to avoid. He forces you to look at the world in a different way. Above all, he forces you to look, which is not bad. And then it occurred to me that this talk could almost take the title Walking Around the Pavillon Suisse. Because as it happens, I mentioned Lasden. But then remember that James Sterling's thesis was actually an extremely sophisticated reorganization of the Pavillon Suisse. Sterling was a Mannerist, of course. Flory building, 1969, more or less, is an ingenious rendition of two principal models around the theme of the dormitory. One is Alto's Baker House, the other is the Pavillon Suisse, blended somehow with the transformation of the type of the court. But as I've gone around the world, I've realized that building was transmitting in every generation. 2 years ago, I was in Pampulha, looking at those astonishing works, the breakthrough works, really, of Niemeyer. Everywhere I looked, there was the ghost of Pavillon Suisse. Hiroshima, the memorial by Tanguy, almost a homage to Pavillon Suisse. And so I could go on and on. So my little reflection will be on this apparently great power that Corbusier has to open people's eyes and to get them to look at the world in a different way, to provide them with solutions of all kinds which can be copied if you want to trivialize them, but much more to the point, can be transformed. Some years ago, I wrote a piece which was called Le Corbusier as a Mirror and a Lens, by which I meant to say, look, people find themselves through Corbusier, and I think we've seen it here, but they see, with his help, ways of looking at problems, ways of understanding them. And I've seen this operating now over the years in many of my own researches on different people. When I wrote about Doshi in India, for example, part of the whole thing was to understand how Corbusier was, yes, a major mentor for him, but precisely for that reason, someone who had to be struggled with, rejected, turned into something else. Or how a basic prototype, like the Monol, which became the Petite Maison du Weekend, which became other things again, could be absorbed in different agendas in India, in Colombia, in Holland. Could Alder van Eyck have made that astonishing work, The Orphanage, without the Petite Maison du Weekend? I very much doubt it. So that's the general drift of what I want to say. So I'm going to read parts of it and interpret freely in other parts. But with a quotation from George Kubler, The Shape of Time. The time of history, a sea occupied by innumerable forms of a finite number of types. There is no single key to the enigmatic world of Le Corbusier. As well as being an architect, an urbanist, a painter, a sculptor, a writer, a designer of furniture, he was the founding father of modern architecture, and yet he was constantly inspired by both nature and tradition. His buildings move us directly through their control of form, space, light, material, and proportion, but they also crystallize a vision of the world. They are like constructed myths, combining utopian visions for the future with reminiscences of an idealized past. Le Corbusier is a figure of vast historical dimensions, who presents multiple facets and identities. His realized buildings are but visible fragments of a much larger universe of ideas and forms. His examples remain active and continue to inspire inventions in places remote from the point of origin. Le Corbusier's buildings communicate before they are understood. That's what happened to me. It's what's happened to almost everybody I've listened to here. First of all, there's the presence, the invasion of consciousness, I think great architecture seduces you at a pre-conscious level. It touches you physically, mentally, it moves you into another realm. Yes, you construct rationalizations, explanations, and so you should, but somehow the essential transmission occurs a little bit below the level of full consciousness. Most people who have been to the chapel at Grandchamp, for example, come away transformed by the building's intangible presence, its interior space bathed in dim light, its unfolding convex and concave forms, its magical relationship to the surrounding landscape. Even those who think that they know Le Corbusier's architecture from books or through the astonishing black and white photographs of his oeuvre complete are forced to revise their opinions when they see the buildings firsthand. No photograph or drawing can replace the experience of ascending the ramp of the Villa Savoie at Poissy through different intensities of space, light, transparency, not to mention, of course, the framing of the view. From reproductions, it is impossible to grasp how the Capitole in Chandigarh seems to pull the vast Indian sky down to the earth and to launch the eye towards the foothills of the Himalayas. This ensemble is both a cosmic landscape and a piece of land art before its time. To understand Le Corbusier properly, it is necessary to find the right balance between the unique order and experience of his works and the general principles which inform them. There is a constant oscillation between the individual statement and the type. Villa Savoie, for example, is an inimitable work, but it also crystallizes the architect's ideas about the modern dwelling and is virtually a demonstration of his 5 points and so much else besides. Pavillon Suisse is a student dormitory raised up above the ground on pilotis, but it is also an urbanistic demonstration, a manifesto, like a slice of the collective housing from Le Corbusier's ideal city, Ville Radieuse. Le Corbusier had definitions for things at all scales: cities, skyscrapers, windows, chairs. In fact, the entire range of the equipment for modern life. Certain of his formulations, such as the domino structural skeleton in reinforced concrete of 1914, were fundamental to his own architectural language and, of course, his urbanism. But they later became part of the collective unconscious of modern architecture. Le Corbusier referred to his own life as a patient search. In his paintings, his sculptures, his buildings, and his urban schemes, he reverted time and again to a limited range of motifs which underwent constant transformation as he discovered new combinations of form and content. His creative process seems to involve a perpetual oscillation between reason and intuition, observation and abstraction. For him, drawing was a way to penetrate the spirit of things and to study the principles behind phenomena: clouds, boats, shells, trees, machines, the human body, and so one could go on and on. Particular things captured in sketches will be gradually translated into symbolic motifs and spatial ideas which nourished all of his activities. Painting was a daily discipline through which he probed simultaneously the outer world of the senses and the inner world of memories, images, and dreams in search of the roots of form. Le Corbusier hoped to understand the underlying order of nature and through a kind of abstraction to transform this order into his architecture. Corbusier's art was influenced by many major 20th century developments, from Cubism to Surrealism and beyond. His debts to Picasso were immense, especially concerning fragmentation, spatial ambiguity, and collage. Le Corbusier's visual ideas seem to have worked on several levels at once. His drawings could suggest different things simultaneously: musical instruments, bottles, women, landscapes, buildings, but they also possessed a life of their own as hieroglyphs, as pure forms. He stole things from the world and submitted them to alchemical changes, translating them into the stuff of his imagination. A root found on a mountainside would gradually turn into a bull's head in a painting, and then would undergo further transformations in a wooden sculpture or in the profile of a building. A Roman ruin sketched during his youthful travels, the Canopus at Hadrian's Villa, would contribute to the idea of top-lit towers in the chapel at Ranchamp 40 years later. Le Corbusier declared that the past was his only real master, but he transformed it in unexpected ways. Metamorphosis was central to his way of seeing, of thinking, and of inventing. Naturally, all of this leads to the question, what is the relevance of Le Corbusier's legacy today? When Le Corbusier's buildings were first built, they had the force of immediate revelations of modernity. With distance, their role shifted to that of historical exemplars, and these have since been experienced, reinterpreted, absorbed, internalized, and transformed in unexpected and unpredictable ways. In the process, they have been crossbred with diverse intentions, societal agendas, and architectural traditions. Each generation finds, as it were, its own version of Le Corbusier, usually by projecting its own concerns upon the powerful yet somewhat ambiguous forms which he has left to the world. His forms seem to clarify dimly felt historical imperatives for others, even to address some of the contradictions of modernization itself. Machinism and nature, modernity and tradition, the universal and the local, to name some of the recurrent polarities, coexist as forces within a complex structure of thought, feeling, and form. It is precisely because they contain these oppositions that Le Corbusier's prototypes can be read in such diverse ways. Le Corbusier tried to understand the forces and contradictions of the Industrial Revolution at the scale of city, landscape, even territory. He was a prophet who was also the bearer of the bad news about the price that was to be paid for so-called progress. He even became a convenient scapegoat, as if he was somehow personally responsible for every freeway wrecking a city or every banal housing block. Le Corbusier wished to channel the inevitable into a more coherent urban form where mechanization, society, and nature would achieve a utopian harmony. Understandably, his plans have been criticized for their reductivism, but they may also be seen as theorems or hypotheses which do not need to be taken literally, but which force a new way of looking at problems. In so many ways, Le Corbusier anticipated the forces and building types of globalization. His prototypes, such as the Unité d'Habitation at Marseille, still have many, many lessons to teach us. They may be reread at the level of principles and core ideas, then transformed in a critical way, and I underline, in a critical way. Such are the dynamics of a modern architectural tradition. The historian who wishes to investigate the impact of a major inventor upon followers can have a field day with Le Corbusier. The results cover the whole range from rich transformations to stale imitations and academic cliches. A broad distinction can be drawn between the letter and the spirit, between those who copy and devalue and those who dig down to principles and architectural ideas before effecting transformations of their own. Does one need to be reminded that all traditions contain chains of solutions stemming from strong prototypes? Every generation has found some new implications in the domino idea, tropical transparency with Niemeyer, geological strata with Lasden, interlocking floors with Koolhaas, hollow tree-like columns with Ito. Or take Le Corbusier's vaulted house type, known as the Monol 1919, which formed the basis of Petite Maison du Weekend, the Maison Sarabai, and so on, as well as a host of unbuilt projects. This Corbusian formulation, rich in possible rapprochement between the vernacular and the industrial, the modern and the traditional, was later transformed by Indian architects, I mentioned Doshi, and of the other side of the world by Salmona, into a synthesis addressing issues of local climate and Latin American identity. Another 3 minutes? As if it is as if later architects continued lines of research that Le Corbusier had already set in place. Take the question of democratic monumentality, addressed in the state buildings on the Capitol in Chandigarh. One of the central themes of these buildings is the giant protective portico open to public space. Echoes of this idea can be found later, in later years, in statements of Republican monumentality, the Grand Arche de la Défense, 1985, by Spreckelson, and the Masterly Supreme Court in Mexico City, designed by Teodoro González de Leon, who incidentally was in the studio in 1947. Or consider the string of works inspired by Pavillon Suisse, which include, as I mentioned, Tanguay's historic Hiroshima War Memorial, Lasden's Royal College Physicians, Sterling's Florey Building, and so many more. In each case, different aspects of the prototype were absorbed and rethought in another personal language. In effect, Le Corbusier has functioned as both mirror and lens for numerous later architects. He's helped them to find themselves while also helping them to define a focus of interest. I'm in the last paragraph. This process has continued in the recent past, continues in the present, and is likely to continue into the future. There are contemporary architects of every stripe who have been clearly marked by Corbusier. There are also architects who absorb less visible lessons. I'm thinking of the constant reworking of the free plan as an idea, for example, which we find in so much recent work, say Sajima or others of this ilk. Or Gehry has revealed that Ronchamp was one of the inspirations which enabled him to discover his true way, along with the cathedral at Chartres, incidentally. It also turns out that Tadiwando has said the same thing, but in his case, though, it was along with the void and light of the Pantheon in Rome. One can scarcely imagine two more different architects, each of them inspired by contrasting aspects of the same building, meaning Ronchamp, one in the direction of sculptural curves, complexity, and dynamism, the other in the direction of light, space, and silence. Such is the power of a major work to stir the emotions and imagination through the direct experience of architecture. Shortly before he died, Le Corbusier wrote a piece entitled "Nothing is Transmissible but Thought," in which he reflected upon his legacy. For him, buildings themselves were materialized ideas and constructed thoughts. Le Corbusier's prodigious architectural forms continue to hold our attention because they have this power to transmit through time. Meanwhile, younger generations emerge who look at him with fresh eyes. Armed with new questions, they discover unprecedented dimensions in this challenging and charismatic figure. Like the mysterious Sphinx, Le Corbusier haunts the observer with his riddles and his enigmatic presence. He is likely to be with us for a long time to come.